Aferim.
Sorry?
Bring the house lights?
Oh, yeah, that's Riley. He will do it.
Okay. I want to thank all of y'all for coming. Is the mic on? I don't think my mic's on. Bring the house lights down and spotlight out.
Okay. How's that? Can y'all hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you very much for coming tonight. I think it really demonstrates your courage and conviction as cinema lovers, that all of you, when your friends said, "What are you doing Thursday night?" you said, "I'm going to go see a Romanian Western no one has ever heard of." I mean, it sounds like a punchline from a New York comedy. Before we start, I really want to thank everyone at CCA. I want to thank J.C. Gonzalez, who handled all the publicity. I want to thank Pearl Hesselden, Riley Gardner, who is our projectionist, Aria Kyoto, and especially Mark Dellis, who's doing the slides tonight. The thing I missed most during COVID was going to the movies. And while I really treasure going to Violet Crown until in the afternoon and being the only person in the theater, I really love to be in a jam-packed movie theater. And it's really the Jungian campfire where we get together to share emotions and feelings and revel in a tale told in the dark. And that's our most ancient community as a species, gathering to hear a tale told in the dark. And that's what we're going to do tonight. We're going to gather and we're going to revel. Okay. America has given the world 4 art forms that are specifically American, could only come from America, and reflect America deeply. And those 4 art forms are jazz and all its descendants, film noir, and in May I'm going to show an amazing film noir here, the road movie, and I'm going to show an amazing road movie in this series, and the Western. America's first narrative film was a Western, 1903's Great Train Robbery. So the Western has been embedded in American visual psyche since visual storytelling began. It's absolutely primal to American movie DNA. And the Western has always been a moral melodrama. Good and evil clearly delineated. I mean, there are some subversive Westerns that subvert this, and you have them on your list, and you'll really enjoy them. But foundationally, the Western presents a moral universe. Now, if you're going to have clearly delineated right and wrong, that can only occur in an ordered world. This is a classic Western frame, and you'll see that it's as ordered as it can be. Earth below, sky above, man, and it's always man in a Western, against the landscape. If he's a hero, he's big. You know, you'll see the Western close-up with the sky behind him. If he's a villain or he's in trouble, the landscape will dominate him. But it always takes place in this perfectly ordered world. And the landscape will define the man's power. Now, if you have a culture, a 60-year culture, in which the biggest man, the manliest man, the most important man, the biggest hero, was the guy that shot first, the guy that finishes fastest, that's not a culture that prioritizes the needs of ladies. And you'll see that throughout these Westerns. Now, Westerns are myths. And because they're myths, the people, the men who appear in Westerns are heroic archetypes. And God help my parents' generation who grew up with this guy, came home from the war and had this guy as a heroic archetype. But they did, and he shaped American culture and thinking. Interestingly now, you know, the Western is weirdly irrelevant. It's not the seat of where American mythology gets shown, and all the toxic mythologies that came with Westerns, overt masculinity, manifest destiny, white man's burden, racism, sexism, it's all gone. You don't see platforms for that anymore. What's very interesting to me is at the same time that you had these perfectly ordered universes, in another parallel cinematic universe, you had film noir. Now, that's rather a different frame, isn't it? Here, the world is absolutely oppressing
These men. James Whitmore. Did my mic go dead? Yeah. Okay. James Whitmore, y'all can hear me, right?
Yeah.
James Whitmore can't even stand up. Remember, the frame is the world. James Whitmore can't even stand up. The world is oppressing him so badly. And the character on the left has identity is just bleeding off into the world.
And the other two characters can't even sit up straight because it's so oppressive. They live in a shadowland. So the noir was about as opposite as Westerns could be, but in the classic post-war period of the Western, you also had the classic post-war noir. Now, if we're talking about Westerns, we got to deal with the John Ford problem. Now, this is from the Searchers. No one could compose like John Ford. Look at that frame. That is what you call inhabited space. The power of it, the dynamism. Let's go to the next slide. And his narrative ability, his ability to tell you everything about the narrative in the frame is extraordinary and singular. Can y'all still hear me if I stand like this?
Yeah.
Is that good? All right. Let's take a tour. Let's take a tour of this frame. Here are two men that are arguing. Because the woman is in between them, she is obviously the object of the argument. But in this frame, they're huge and she's tiny. So she's not really the object of the argument. She's the excuse for the argument. Their argument takes place between two opposing moral viewpoints. At the same time, they're in the most barren landscape possible. Nothing is growing in this landscape. Nothing could ever. And the landscape is a metaphor for their toxic family dynamic. Now, you see that John Wayne is the supplicant here, obviously, and Jeffrey Hunter has the higher moral ground. To the filthy-minded among you, this may suggest incipient fellatio, but I don't think that's John Ford's purpose. This is to tell you who's got the higher moral ground. But the other fascinating thing about this frame is it really evokes pre-Renaissance and Renaissance paintings, the classic painting of the saint in the desert, and the angel comes down to talk to him. And Ford took that. But whatever goes on in this frame, what's the most foregrounded object in the frame? It's the rifle. So Ford is telling you that however this gets resolved, it's going to be the rifle that settles it. So much incredible information in the frame. Okay, next one, please. But the trouble is, if you watch this film with the sound off, it's a masterpiece. If you watch this film with the sound on, it's just unbearable. It's 8th grade, it's juvenile. The depiction of women is just so cringeworthy and embarrassing. There's only 3 women in the John Ford universe. They're virgins, they're whores, and they're mothers who got revirginated by dint of motherhood. And if you watch a number of John Ford films, you come to the conclusion that John Ford never had a post-orgasmic conversation with a woman in his life. And by that I mean her orgasm, not his. And I've also sadly concluded that the people who love the Searchers, they're people who love Led Zeppelin. They love momentum and virtuosity, but don't care about content. Okay. 60 years after the Great Train Robbery came the flaming sword that swept all before it. The first Ramones album, if you will, of Westerns. And that was Sergio Leone. Now, Clint Eastwood said it best when he said, this was the first time ever the hero fired first. And Leone was saying, screw the moral universe of the Western, it's all nonsense. The Westerns are pure capitalism reduced to its nth. Dead bodies were goods and products, and the guy that got the most dead bodies got the most money, and he won. And nobody cared whether he was a hero or not. Clint Eastwood shot people in the back all the time. The other way that Leone destroyed the classic Western was he turned the Western into pop art. All these really shiny objects. He observed everything through a certain bemused irony. And even his gunshot sounds don't sound like gunshots. What they sound like are the sounds illustrating gunshots in comic books, and more particularly in Lichtenstein's paintings. So Leone's gunshots all go ka-pew, ka-pew, ka-pow, ka-pow, just like the cartoon balloons. And he, by bringing irony to the Western and suggesting that the Western was fundamentally ridiculous and turning the Western into cartoon, he just undermined all the Western themes. But he also had great impact when he reversed the Western visual trope, the dominant Western visual trope, with his gigantic close-ups. Nobody had seen close-ups this big, ever. So, why did he go to these close-ups and use them all the time and show men and women in the close-ups? Because he's reversing the basic Western visual paradigm. He has turned the face into the landscape. When you go to the next level, yes, he turned the face into the landscape, and he put, I won't say men just in his case, he put people as primal, not the landscape. He made the Western existential, and he also said that the Western is all derived from Homer, because Homer is about the individual trying to make his way in the world. And by making the close-ups of the landscape, that's what Leone did. Now, nobody can make a serious Western after Leone, so Leone created the revisionist Western. Now, Donald Glover, who created Atlanta, the great comedian and writer and director, and who raps under the name Childish Gambino, said quite a brilliant thing about hip-hop. He said he feared it would never escape its adolescence. And the classic Western never escaped its adolescence, but the revisionist Western brought in adult themes. This, I think, is the most adult Western ever made, McCabe and Mrs. Miller. And because it's the most adult Western ever made, it's the most tragic Western ever made. So here comes this onslaught of revisionist Westerns, all of them dedicated to burning the Western to the ground, even though they were made by directors who loved Westerns. And they're all great Westerns, but they're all wiping the Western off the face of the earth. So you have The Wild Bunch, and then you have Peter Fonda's Hired Hand, which is very beautifully shot by Sven Nykvist, who was Bergman's cinematographer, and there are some gorgeous psychedelic sequences in this, of all things. Then you have Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, which even Sam Peckinpah recognized that the Western was over, and this is his elegiac tribute to the Western, but believe me, the director's cut is so much worse and so much more misogynistic than the commercial cut. And that's true of all of Peckinpah's films. This is a very beautiful film, but don't watch a director's cut. And then finally, the apotheosis of the revisionist Western, Dennis Hopper's deranged, insane last movie. Now, we all know artists that we would describe as hallucinés. Borges is a halluciné. Man Ray is a halluciné. Hilma af Klint, maybe the first abstract painter, is a halluciné. Duchamp, and the surrealist filmmaker Maya Deren, whose films you can see on YouTube and they're really worth seeing, is a halluciné. But Hopper, when he was turned completely loose to ingest anything he wanted and shoot anything he wanted, is a halluciné and a half. Now, the last time when Paul presented A Man Escaped, did such a brilliant job, I mentioned Paul Schrader's book, Transcendent Style in Film. And there's a new edition of it, that's the one on the right. And he talks about Bresson and Dreyer and Ozu. And a great book about transcendent film. Happily, in the new edition, he talks about Andrei Tarkovsky's Andrei Rublev. How many of y'all have seen Andrei Rublev? How many of you seen it on a big screen? I'd love to show it here, it's 3.5 hours. If you can get a chance, I urge you to see it. Andrei Rublev is among the most immersive films I know. It hurls you into the 11th century. Okay, next slide, please. It hurls you into the 11th century. It doesn't explain anything. You have to take all your clues from the context. It's an incredibly beautiful, powerful work. Schrader characterizes it as one of the starts of slow cinema. It is a very slow film. Tarkovsky understood that profound things happen when you slow things down. And does he ever? Aferim is not slow cinema, but what it shares with Rublev is that it hurls you into its world. Okay, next slide, please. It hurls you into its world, it hurls you into 1865 and immerses you in a way you can hardly believe it. Now, we all know books that when you start reading them, the pages go away, the Kindle goes away, the sofa goes away, that pillow behind your neck you can never get right goes away, and you feel like you're just holding life right there in your hands. Now, for me, one of these books is Life and Fate by Vasily Grossman. So I wanted to take a minute and ask you to think about a book or a film that has immersed you that totally. And we'll do a little whip around, ask you to raise your hand, and no editorial comments, no nothing, just say the book and the author or the name of the film. And I will get around to all of you. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about this while you think about it. Grossman was a war correspondent at Stalingrad. This is about the siege of Stalingrad and life under Stalin. And when Grossman was in poor health, he asked a friend of his, a KGB major, if he should publish the book. And the major told Grossman, certainly if you want to get shot. And so he entrusted the manuscript to the major and asked him to burn it when he died so there'd be no repercussions on his family. The major smuggled it to London when he defected, and the book was brought into print. It's 900 pages, and it's a book you either read 5 pages or 100 pages at a time, you have no choice. So I asked Paul to be the first person to name an immersive book. Paul, where are you? So please, holler out.
Dostoevsky's The Idiot.
Okay, who else would like to name a book or a film? Hands?
Eraserhead.
Okay, who else?
The Magic Mountain.
The book is a film.
The book.
Okay, who else? Please.
A Brief History of 7 Killings.
Interesting, okay, who else? Please.
Ahab's Wife, book by Jenna Setter-Naslund.
Say the author's name again, please.
Jenna Setter-Naslund.
Thank you. Who else? A book or a film?
Inception.
Okay, who else? Brian, you got one?
All Quiet on the Western Front.
A new one?
Okay. In the back?
Anna Karenina.
All right, who else? Heaven's Gate. Brava! Because
Yeah.
it's my bad that I didn't mention Heaven's Gate. Because Heaven's Gate is such an underrated film, an unfairly criticized film, such a beautiful film, such an important revisionist Western, and really proof of what Wolfpack's American critics can be. And there's a beautiful Blu-ray of it, so thank you. Who else?
Gravity's Rainbow,
An author?
Thomas Pynchon.
Thank you.
Ruby's Harp.
Author?
Can't tell you.
Okay. Ruby's Heart?
No,
Burmese.
Burmy, the film. Harp of Burma.
Oh, Harper Burma. Okay, sorry.
Hiroshima.
Who else?
The Leopard.
The Leopard. Another 3.5 hours well spent. Who else?
Sight and Tango.
Say that again.
Sight and Tango.
Okay. Who else? Satan Tango. Who else?
The Glass Palace, Amitabh Ghosh.
All right.
Shantaram.
All right. Okay. Thank you. And I find tonight's film incredibly immersive, and I have every expectation that y'all will too. All right. Now, a very compressed and ignorant history of the Romanian Revolution. You ready?
Yeah.
Next slide. Nikolai and Madame Ceausescu ruled Romania for 25 bloody, repressive, authoritarian, violent years. They were overthrown in the Christmas 1989 revolution. And the people that overthrew them took them out back and shot them. And you know, Madame Ceausescu loved to watch people get tortured. And the executioners were very, very careful not to shoot either one of them in the face. Because they knew that everyone was so terrified of Ceausescu, he penetrated every aspect of Romanian life, that if they couldn't see his face clearly on a corpse, they would never believe he was dead. So, he's overthrown, and there's incredible faction fighting in the streets. The kind of faction fighting you never see, where civilians are siding with soldiers against other soldiers and civilians. The apparatchiks of the regime were fighting against civilians and the military. Next slide, please. And when it finished, when the fighting finished, nobody knew what was happening. Nobody had a clue for one good reason. The one state television channel went dark. And when it went dark, no one had a clue. And there were cameramen perched in front of television sets who wouldn't stop filming because they wanted to get the first instant. And a Romanian poet said, at that moment, if film is possible, then history is possible too. So that film was entwined in post-revolutionary Romania from the first instant. And then the screen lights up. And what do Romanians see? No soldiers, no gun, no grenade. What they saw were writers and poets, men and women, not a uniform in sight. And one of Romania's foremost poets did this. He held up a pen. And the first thing he said was, with this, we will rebuild Romania. And so, let me get my next page here. It's said that the great Russian film theorist, Sergei Eisenstein, and unpronounceable Podolkin were such genius film theorists because for 3 years after the revolution, Russia was so heavily embargoed, they ain't got any film. All they could do was write about it. They couldn't shoot it. So that when the time came to shoot, they were ready with their ideas. And it was a parallel situation in Romania because Romanians had nothing. They had no lights, they had no dollies, they had no cranes, they had camera and film. And what they sought out to do was what they'd never been allowed to do, which is tell the truth about their own society. So Romanian cinema is naturalist. People don't talk like they do in the movies. They talk like they do in conversation. It's humanist. It's always understated. It's very beautifully written. A Romanian film I love is Police Adjective. 4 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days is a great place to start for Romanian cinema. It's understated and humanist, but still a depiction of the brutality of life under the regime that has one instance of violence in it, but it's still brutal. Okay, Police Adjective, please. This is one of the slowest movies ever made. I'm not kidding. It's only 2 hours long. It's unbelievably slow. And the climax, which hits as hard as the climax of Die Hard, is 3 people having a discussion over a dictionary. And when I showed this film to my students, they groaned all their way through it, but every time I taught it at the end of the semester, they all said, that was the best film, that was the most powerful film. And that's the way these Romanian films work. They really sneak up on you. Not this film so much, but a lot of the films on your list. Okay, Aferim. And I'm going to save most of my notes on Aferim for afterward. You'll notice that when we talk about Aferim, I'm never going to say the word gypsy, because gypsy is an ethnic slur. I'm going to refer to these people by their proper name, which is Roma and Romani. You know, when you say he really gypped me on that deal, that's an ethnic slur. Romania enslaved the Romani until 1865 for hundreds of years. And you'll hear familiar ethnic slurs through this film. That's not a sop or pandering to the American audience. That's the way the Romanians spoke. And the way that they regard the Roma as subhuman is especially depressing to Americans because it's such a mirror to our own slave history. Now, the director, as I say, hurls you into this world and explains nothing. If this was an American film, you know, our character would say, well, Bob, you know, we've been enslaving the Roma for centuries. There's no exposition. You have to suss everything out from the cultural clues you're given, and I'm very reluctant to deny you that experience. So I'm reluctant to explain too much, but briefly, 1835 Romania was in the Ottoman Empire, but under control of the Russians. It was a feudal country with a lot of small fiefdoms. The fiefdoms were run by boyars. In Russia, the highest rank of nobility. In Romania, local chieftains whose word was law. Now, this explores Romanian history in a way that Americans very seldom explore American history. And the director walks an amazing tightrope between the Romanian story and classic Westerns. Because as Western pop culture has colonized the imagination of the world, of everyone in the world, Jude shows how Western mythology, not the real thing, the mythology, has colonized and shaped his story. Thank you very much.